Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel, the last panel of the day on fighting voter suppression. We are happy that you have joined us. We have organized a great panel for you, and hopefully that if you have questions for our panelists, that you will put them in the chat. The panel what we'll be talking about today, primarily focusing on looking at contemporary issues relating to voter suppression. But we want to start off by talking about some of the historic voter suppression issues. And when I started preparing for the panel, oh, I'm sorry, I'm Elsie Scott. I am the director of the Ron Walters Center, Ron Walters Leadership and Public Policy Center here at Howard University. And I am happy to join you. I am a political scientist by training. I'm the former president of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And my interest in this whole topic of voter suppression started from my childhood because I'm the daughter of civil rights activists. But before we get started with our panel, I see that our provost has joined us, and we want to see if he would like to make a few opening remarks. Provost Anthony Wuto, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, and good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Dr. Scott. I wanted to thank you, first of all, for moderating this session and our esteemed colleagues for participating. This has been, I've been able to sit in on a few of the sessions thus far in the conference. I've been really impressed with the content and with the dialogue, and I'm looking forward to this session, particularly in the context of the pending general elections and what we are aware of has been taking place around the country for decades now in terms of voter suppression, particularly among African American communities. So I want to again thank each of our panelists and thank you for moderating this session. I also want to just acknowledge and thank Dean Williams and Dean Holly Walker for the roles that they have played in really coordinating the overall conference. Happy homecoming, and I'll just, as I said earlier, I'll just be a fly on the wall rather than a fly on someone's forehead and pay attention in the background. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. No, we don't want to talk about flies today. But so we'll get started with our discussion, and what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about put in a historical perspective on voter suppression, and then I'll introduce the panelists. They will each have about 10 minutes to give a presentation. Then we'll come back and see whether they'd like to engage each other in some of the discussion that we've had. In the meantime, if we get any questions in the chat, then we'll try to answer some of the questions and engage those of you who are participating in the panel today. So I'll just get started. When I started working with the committee, one of the things we were told that since we didn't have homecoming as traditional homecoming here at Howard, and Howard is known as having the best homecoming in the country. And I say that as a person who graduated from another HBCU who feel like we have a good homecoming, but I think Howard might top us in that you are able to bring in a lot of big time entertainment. But one of the ideas they had for this conference was to bring together students, faculty, staff, and alums to look at some of the current issues that are facing our nation, us being what most people consider to be the premier HBCU in the country. And so I have to applaud the committee for putting together some great panels, and hopefully people have had a chance to connect with some of the panels. The other thing they wanted to do was to showcase some of the talent that Howard has, both in terms of its current faculty as well as alums who have graduated out of here. So we have a combined panel here today. I think Wade Henderson is probably our only alum that's on the panel, but the rest of us, oh no, Michael Fauntroy is an alum also. Sorry about that. uh, so what we want to do is to showcase the talent that we have here. And so when I started planning for this panel, I started looking at history as to what has been Howard's role in fighting voter suppression. And it's interesting that so many people talk about the history of Howard and what Howard students have done, but we really need a good written history. So I want to challenge the historians that are out there, is that we really need some good books talking about all the great things that Howard students have done through the years. I had a chance to sit on part of the panel this morning with some of the members of SNCC. And I guess SNCC is the most important student movement that ever came through Howard. And perhaps I could say it for all HBCUs. Somebody said that yesterday on a panel. But they gave us some good history on how they were engaged, not necessarily just on voter suppression, but also in the whole civil rights movement. And then I also know, being a member of Delta Sigma Theta, I know that's the first instance I know of Howard students being engaged in fighting voter suppression was during the suffrage movement. And when they had the suffragette march in downtown Washington in 1913, that AKA president, I know, sent a letter asking for AKAs to be involved, but I guess they didn't get a positive answer because you did not have a Black speaker. And the Blacks were told they had to get in the back of the line. And so at least 22 students from Howard University became a part of that march. So we have a whole history here at Howard of being engaged in fighting voter suppression. I know of some instances where Michael Fauntroy's uncle, when he was the delegate for DC, had students engaged in various activities. And some of us who were not students, who were now young people in the movement, he had us involved in fighting voter suppression. But as a child, I grew up in the South. I grew up in Louisiana. And my father was, I guess, the civil rights leader for my section of Louisiana. And Black people had not voted in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana since the 1920s. And he decided at some point that he wanted to vote. He wanted to register to vote. And it took him 15 years of fighting in order to get the right to vote. And so when I look back on some of the things that they did in terms of the voter suppression tactics they used back in the Jim Crow era, that some of them are similar and some today are more sophisticated, some of the tactics. But one of the tactics they used that I remember most vividly was that you had to have 2 registered voters identify you if you wanted to vote. And there were no Black people because they had purged all the Black people off the rolls post-Reconstruction. And Black people could not find 2 white people who would come and say they knew them well enough to identify them to become registered voters. And try as they may, some of the Black people worked for white people and they thought that their white people would come and identify them, but it didn't happen. And so that was one of the major impediments. You know, you hear a lot about the literacy test, but my folks knew how to pass the literacy test because it had been around long enough and they were leaders in the NAACP. So I think by that time, the NAACP had every copy of the literacy test to the point that they could train people on how to pass the literacy test. So it wasn't just the literacy test in terms of the multiple choice question, but they also in Louisiana had a thing where you had to read and interpret the Constitution. And the interpretation was left up to the clerk of the registrar of voters. And so if he told you to define domestic tranquility, and you are a person who hasn't even graduated from elementary school, and you're trying to define that, and even if you graduated from college, that the registrar may not even understand what the definition of domestic tranquility. You had to sometime recite the whole preamble to the Constitution. So as Black people started learning, memorizing the preamble, then they came up with something else. So they had all these tactics. Another one was cross burning, something they don't use anymore because I guess Black people are not intimidated by crosses that are burned. In fact, they burned so many crosses at our house until they didn't even bother us anymore. They had put so many out there. But there were all these different tactics, but it was not until the federal government became involved that people were, in my area, were able to successfully fight the voter suppression. That it wasn't until they created the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and they came to Louisiana and held hearings. And my father was the first one to testify before that hearing, that then the U.S. Department of Justice had created the Civil Rights Division, and they sent civil rights attorneys down to take my father's case because he had tried to have a private case with NAACP, but that didn't go anyplace. So it was not until the federal government got involved. And the federal government was sort of the champion all the way through. And it's interesting, and we can have some discussion about that the federal government now has become the enemy in terms of preventing us from having the right to vote. The federal government and state governments. At that time, it was mainly the state government of Louisiana that was fighting it. But eventually, my father and mother got registered to vote only because they were registered to vote in federal court. And they might have been some of the first, if not the first people to ever get registered by a federal judge. And on their voter registration card, they had the signature of the federal judge. But of course, the state of Louisiana sued the federal government and said that that was the state's right. They had taken away the state right of providing registration of citizens in a particular state. But of course, when they sued the federal government, they lost because they had to go to federal court. So I just wanted to throw the little personal history out there as we sort of set the stage for talking about voter suppression in the United States. But I cannot stop without mentioning the role of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was the major factor as to why so many Black people in the South finally got registered to vote, especially in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, the deep South states. Many of those people, they didn't have these individual lawsuits. And many of the people, even in my hometown, after my mother and father, the 26 people that were registered in federal court, they still had to individually fight all these different tactics that were out there. They had to pay the poll taxes in Mississippi, et cetera. But once the Voting Rights Act was passed, they sent federal registrars into the South, and they were able to cut through a lot of the tactics. But then what happened? We had Shelby versus Holder. After some people thought that we no longer had a problem, or at least they pretended they thought that we no longer have a problem. So the Supreme Court came in and undid what had been done, a lot of the positive stuff that had happened in the 60s and the 70s. So we can talk about what has happened since Shelby versus Holder. We can predict what we think might happen with this new Supreme Court, or what might happen in the Congress, because we do now have, of course, it's not going to pass because they're not going to do too much else this session, but we do have the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that has passed in the House, but it's part of the big backlog of legislation that's sitting in Senator McConnell's office. So we can talk about that. So there's a lot for us to talk about today, but let me introduce our panelists and get them started. And then they're free to add any additional introduction, because often, you send somebody 2 lines about yourself and then you get there and say, oh, I should have sent that, because that's more pertinent to what I'm talking about today. So you all feel free to wave your flags, talk about yourself, what you've done, because you're not getting paid today. So you might as well get something out of, maybe you get a speaking engagement or something later on. But our first speaker will be an old friend of mine, Wade Henderson. Wade Henderson is the immediate past president of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. And I think Wade probably has worked for more of the civil rights organization than anybody else, because I think he's worked for the NAACP, the ACLU, the Leadership Conference on, now you haven't worked for the, Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, that's where you were last. And you didn't work for the Lawyers Committee, right? But he's been around, and he's been one of our champions in fighting for civil and human rights for many, many years. I need to mention, well, I've already mentioned that he's an alum. I think you're a 1970 graduate of Howard University. We are sorry that you didn't get a chance to have your 50th celebration, but maybe at some point this pandemic will pass and you all can come in March with your medallions and make your big contribution to Howard University. But we're happy to have Wade here. I met Wade when he was dean at Rutgers School of Law, and he did some things that many people who met him in his later life don't know, how Wade really was successful in bringing a lot of Black students into the Rutgers Law School. And in fact, at one point that was known as the place to go, because Wade had recruited so many people that were interested in civil rights and in Black issues as it relates to the law, bringing them to Rutgers. Our second speaker will be Michael Fauntroy, another alum of Howard University, and he's presently an associate professor here at Howard University in political science, and he teaches African American politics. Many of you see him on TV commentating after every election. I know he has a lot of work to do now because it's kind of hard to interpret some of the stuff that's going on, but we're looking forward to your commentating, Michael.
Thank you.
He also teaches courses in interest groups, the presidency, and political parties. He's been at Howard since 2013. I didn't realize you came here the year after I came. And before that, he taught at George Mason University in the School of Public Policy. He's an analyst in American National Government he has been an analyst at the Congressional Research Service. And he was a civil rights analyst with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights when it was doing something that was useful. And I have to mention, because one of my favorite people is his uncle, Walter Fauntroy, who gave me a footing in a lot of activism when I first came to Washington, D.C. Now, Wade will be talking about civil rights organizations and legal organizations and their role in the fight against voter suppression. And then our third speaker will be someone I just met today, Professor Darin Johnson from the School of Law. He's an associate professor of law here at Howard University. He's a graduate of Yale University, and his JD is from Harvard, from the other HU. And he's a varied career. He served as an attorney with the Pentagon, Department of State, and at the White House under President Obama. His research interests include constitutional reform, transitional justice, and the rule of law in post-conflict states, as well as the balance between human rights and national security. So you ask, how did he end up on this panel? He ended up on this panel because he has published on Russian election interference and race baiting. So he will be sharing with us uh, some information on foreign intervention in the election, and we are very interested in hearing what he has to say. So we'll go in that order: Wade, Michael, and then Darin.
Well, thank you, Elsie. I appreciate the introduction, quite generous, and good afternoon, everyone. Elsie, I would only add two things to your introduction of me. You were so gracious, so thank you. One is that I recently retired as the Joseph L. Rao Jr. Professor of Public Interest Law at the David A. Clark School of Law, University of the District of Columbia. I'm very proud of my tenure at UDC Law School, and so I've had to mention that. I'm also an active member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Now, you knew that I would have to say something about Kappas, and particularly given, as you acknowledged, my 50th anniversary homecoming from Howard University. So first, I want to thank my fellow panelists for indulging me and allowing me, because of my seniority, to speak first on the panel. And secondly, to be such a part of it, such an important conversation. Elsie, you deserve special applause, because I think having the Ron Walters Leadership Center serve as the host for this incredibly important conversation is incredibly appropriate and a significant recognition of the role that Ron Walters has played in American politics. The truth is, Ron has long knew that voting is the language of democracy, that if you don't vote, you don't count. He preached that for many years, and his service to Reverend Jackson's presidential campaign and his work beyond that really marked him as one of the great and most insightful political leaders of our time. And you have carried on that great tradition by heading the Ron Walters Leadership Center. So you deserve special credit for hosting today's program. Secondly, I thought your personal story really underscored why this discussion about fighting back against voter suppression is appropriate for the last topic of the day. It is indeed the topic of the moment, and it is quite significant that we are here. Now, I don't need to tell anyone that obviously we are in an unprecedented crisis, both as a community, but also as a nation. The pandemic has devastated the country and has had a particularly significant and disproportionate impact on the Black community. We've had a racial reckoning because of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, unlike anything we have seen since the long hot summer of 1967, where over 150 urban centers erupted in violence, and the following death of Dr. King in 1968 led to a series of urban challenges that certainly rival what we're experiencing today in terms of the intensity and the pressure to dismantle American democracy as we have known it. And then lastly, the economy. The economy is unrivaled in terms of its devastation, unrivaled by anything since the Great Depression of the 30s. And when you take all of those factors together and add to that the most important election of our time, it is an invitation for disruption that goes to the very heart of what American democracy is all about. Now, it was William Shakespeare in The Tempest that taught us the significance of the statement, "The past is prologue to the future," and that knowing something that has happened previously may give you insight into what is going on today. One of the most glaring examples of that truism is the fact that we're celebrating this year the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment was passed as part of that cluster, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, post-Civil War amendments intended to enfranchise and lock into US citizenship formerly enslaved Africans, making us African Americans. The fact that 150 years later, we are struggling with the right to vote, unlike anything we have seen since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, is a statement unto itself about the challenges we face as a nation. And certainly my fellow panelists, I'm sure, will elaborate on that, but I think one need only look at where we are. Now, Elsie, you mentioned the importance of the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Shelby County versus Holder on June 25th, 2013. It put a hole in the Voting Rights Act. It gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act. It made pre-clearance by the Department of Justice examining changes that jurisdictions that had a history of past discrimination should first consult with them, the Justice Department, before implementing those changes. When that provision was gutted 7 years ago, look at the results of this. You get a place like Texas with Governor Abbott, I point this out, a Republican governor, who decides that regardless of the size of your county, there should only be one drop-off center. So in a place like Harris County, which includes 4 million people, and the city of Houston, you have only one place to drop off a single a ballot. It's absolutely outrageous. The impact on Latinx and Black voters is incredible. Look at the long lines that have started in early voting in places like Georgia and Wisconsin, simply because local officials have chosen to craft practices that will have the result of disenfranchising thousands of voters. And most of these practices in many states, red states that are controlled by Republican political machines committed to the preservation of the status quo, they have adopted practices that are devastatingly harmful. Of course, there's also, the kneecapping of the Postal Service. The fact that the Postal Service was expected to be the backbone of a mail-in voting campaign and suddenly finds itself under new leadership in a way that has crippled its effectiveness is a huge, huge problem. And then finally, you have the specter of violence, the specter of election-related violence. And that is, of course, a serious threat that has to be taken seriously. When the governor of Michigan is targeted, as with the governor of Virginia, for potential terrorist threat by white supremacists, you've got a problem. When the Department of Homeland Security issues a report over the objections of the White House that says that white supremacist terrorism is the most significant threat facing the country today, you have a problem. You have a problem. And so even in today's New York Times, there is an article which talks about the prospect of election-related violence because of the rhetoric of President Trump. And one of the officials who's quoted says that, look, I'm not anticipating a civil war, but the likelihood of targeted violence is certainly real. Now, all of this, Elsie, it's a significant threat, but there is an historic thread that I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge, because it was the same kind of threat of violence and actual execution of violence. For example, 2,000 lynchings during the period of Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877, 2,000 lynchings. Lynchings continued up through 1950 and produced about 6,500 lynchings throughout the country. It had a devastating effect on voter registration. The laws that were created by the Jim Crow South that prevented your father from registering to vote. In 1940, in the South colleagues, there were roughly 3% of African Americans that were enrolled to vote. And obviously not because only 3% of African Americans wanted to vote. There were institutional barriers that made it impossible, as in the case of Elsie's father, to carry out the very basic element of the franchise. And we're seeing the same thing today, repeated. It's the, new bottles, but it's the same old wine of systemic racism. And it reflects the fact that the states have been given control over the election process in a way that makes it extremely problematic. And then finally, in this respect, we have problems not just with COVID, not just with the pandemic, not just with violence directed at Black people. We have a problem on Capitol Hill. We have a problem of institutional resistance on the part of the Republican leadership in the Senate. Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, calls himself the Grim Reaper because he stands in the way of the passage of important legislation that would make a difference in the lives of Black Americans and in the lives of Americans generally. We talked, for example, about the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. That passed the House months ago. The fact that we have no protection from the Voting Rights Act, in addition to a hostile Department of Justice Civil Rights Division because of Attorney General Barr, but the fact that we don't have legislative protection should be laid directly at the feet of Mitch McConnell. The fact that we don't have a COVID relief bill for the millions of Americans who desperately need financial assistance should be laid at the feet of Mitch McConnell. And the fact that you have the Senate coming into special session to approve the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court is one of the most classic examples of court packing I think I've ever seen. First, you block the confirmation of a duly appointed or nominated justice on the part of Barack Obama. And he gets to nominate, but his justice nominee does not get approved. Mitch McConnell holds him over under the guise that within a few months of an election, you should not confirm a new justice. And suddenly he turns around to move the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Senate floor. This is court packing in the most extreme. And why is he doing it? Well, among other reasons, he's doing it not just to attack the ACA, the healthcare law, the Obamacare bill that is obviously the target of Republicans in the House and Senate, but he's also doing it to provide an ace in the hole for President Obama in the event that some of these trumped up election manipulation issues come to the courts. It is President Trump's hope that he will have a ace in the hole to allow him to retain office in spite of him having lost all of this. So, you asked me, Elsie, and I'll wrap this up quickly, to talk about the role of civil rights organizations, because they have been, quite frankly, the backbone of preserving American democracy, and they remain the point of the spear, not just on behalf of African Americans, but on behalf of the nation as a whole, in vindicating the rights and privileges of American democracy that we enjoy. I remind you that it was these groups that were responsible for the development and ushering through the House of the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, and they continue to press to get it passed. We're going to have to bring additional pressure to bear on Mitch McConnell, but that's to be saved for another time. We have an election protection effort that has been set up by the Lawyers Committee. 1-866-OUR-VOTE is the phone number. And for those who encounter election difficulties at the polls, using that number to contact someone who can send immediate relief or relief as soon as possible is what it's really all about. And so I certainly support their effort. I also think it's important to talk about the campaign which is underway by the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. The Leadership Conference is a part of that, and other groups, to push for younger people to become poll workers. There's an effort underway to fill the vacancies that have been left because of the ravages of COVID in election workers around the country. They tend to be older people, they tend to be retired people, and because of the impact of COVID on the elderly, they are leaving gaping holes in the poll process. And so recruiting new poll workers is important. A commitment to take everyone to the polls and to make this an issue has been an incredibly gratifying outpouring of organizations and communities. Think, for example, about our professional athletes, the NBA athletes, the NFL athletes, and others who have invested their own resources in setting up mass voting sites where people can vote. That's an extraordinary commitment. Nothing like it have I seen previously, where the African American community and to some degree the progressive community are unified in their view that this election matters and that getting people to vote matters. And you're getting a turnout unlike anything we have ever seen. Now, there are huge challenges ahead of us. They're huge challenges. And regardless, let me say, the outcome of this election is critical. I'm not going to speak to that. If people vote their interests, the outcome is foretold. But I will also say that in the aftermath of the election, there will be much work to be done. And so the same commitment that we have seen as a community has to be carried forth in the work that we do after the election, just as we are investing in work here. This effort, this undertaking, and you're highlighting it, Elsie, is really a call to action. So I hope my brother and sister alumni of Howard, I hope those who hear this panel today will take seriously and take some personal responsibility for helping to ensure that as many people vote as possible, doing what you can to ensure that that outcome works well. So look, this is a time to help build an America as good as its ideals. And that's what this election is about. And that's who we, the HU alumni, and those listening to this call are all about as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Wade. We'll now hear from Dr. Fauntroy. I forgot to mention that your topic, and you might want to change it somewhat, was on conservatives and the conservatives and voter suppression against Black people. I think I probably have the topic wrong, but you can tell it better than me.
That's what it said in the email, and I'm prepared to stick with it. So first I want to just say thank you to you and to Dean Williams and anybody else who thought it would be a good idea for me to be on this panel, because it's such an important topic and one that means a whole lot to me. The only thing I would add to the introduction is that I'm currently on sabbatical this semester because I'm finishing a book on Black voter suppression. So it's difficult to imagine a more timely opportunity for me to talk about a topic that means so much. And so I want to begin by noting sort of some connective tissue for me with Howard University and my own political awareness. As you mentioned, Dr. Scott, I grew up in a pretty political family in the city. My eldest uncle, who is now 94 years old, is a Tuskegee Airman and was dropped out of high school, ended up in Tuskegee and was there training as a cadet when World War II ended. And he became the first member of our family to attend Howard University. He finished his GED and enrolled at Howard as a part-time student. And it took 14 years, but he graduated with an engineering degree and became among the first Black engineers hired by what is now Metro. And so Howard has always been on my radar. I grew up in Northeast DC and used to go and visit my grandparents who lived right along the U Street corridor. And we would drive along 4th Street. And I would wonder, what all this is going on here. I see all these students hanging out, and they look serious and they're carrying books. And what's the deal here? And so Howard has always been a big part of my consciousness. And so after I graduated Hampton University, I came to Howard for graduate school, and that only heightened my political awareness. When I was at Hampton, the Free South Africa movement was launched. And for those of us who were in colleges and universities at that time, particularly HBCUs, the Free South Africa movement was sort of the tent pole of our political awareness. And then, Jesse Jackson's campaign in 1984 for the presidency and again in 1988. Well, you know, I graduate Hampton, come to Howard for graduate school, and, you know, become one of the many students and others who, as Wade Henderson mentioned, came to be aware of Ron Walters and his impact. And he and the other faculty in the Department of Political Science at that time really helped to impact my political awareness, which ultimately led to me making a U-turn and some plans I had career-wise. I wanted to go into city government and run programs, but ended up becoming a college professor in part because of my interaction with faculty and students at Howard. That turned it around for me, and I decided to get a PhD. And one of the things that I learned there that has sort of stuck with me is something that Wade mentioned. You know, Wade mentioned that voting is the language of democracy. And so when you don't vote, you don't speak. You can't be heard, and you cannot have an impact on the larger environment. And so as I've built my own career and focused on the interaction of African Americans with the larger political system, I've concluded that you can always tell how important something is by the lengths to which some will go to keep you from having it. All right? And that is absolutely the case with voting. It has been the key variable that addresses the significant achievements that have been had in Black political, social, and economic development, because as we've heard others say, we got to a point where the hands that once picked cotton could pick presidents and senators and governors and legislators and others who could put into practice what Black voters, Black citizens, Black Americans came to want to have put into practice. And so 150 years later, and Wade mentioned the 15th Amendment, we are still seeing and still having to fight and refight the importance of voting as a fundamental factor in American political development. And so I want to pivot quickly to some numbers. Dr. Scott, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act, and I'm really big on context, and so I want to pivot just a second to give us some sense of context. So the Reconstruction Amendments are passed. There's this period of Reconstruction in which African Americans, for the very first time in the history of our country, are significantly involved in elections, voting, running for and winning seats in legislatures. Then we see a retrenchment on that. We see a reversal. And in 1870, the Black registration rate in Mississippi was 70%, 70, as a reflection of Reconstruction. But after the white redemption movement, by 1889, that number had fallen to 9%, okay? Louisiana saw a Black registration number fall from 130,000 to 5,000 in a 4-year period right after the conclusion of the reversal of Reconstruction. Alabama's 1900 constitutional changes drove down Black registration totals from 181,000 in 1900 to 3,000 total just a few years later. So we are refighting a battle that has been continuous in our existence in this country. And the reason for that is the power that exists within Black voting circles around the country. Given our largely geographic concentration, the reality is Black people in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, among other places, if properly registered and properly turned out can pick winners all up and down the ballot in all of those states. And so the reason why we continue to face this constant oppressive rule changing because of in an effort to get us to advance voter suppression is because there are many people in those states in particular, but around the country, who are fearful of what would happen if Black people were fully enfranchised and fully able to exercise their policy preferences in the same way that people can, that whites can in those same states. And so for me, this is really fundamental, right? Voter suppression is not just about keeping Black people from voting, but it's really about challenging Black humanity, Black citizenship, and the ability for Black people to have a voice. Even after all these years, we're still having to fight these same fights. And then Wade mentioned also the Voting Rights Act, and Dr. Scott, you did as well. The Shelby versus Holder decision is as impactful on Black voting in a negative way as the Voting Rights Act was for Black people in a positive way. And all you need to know to confirm that, sort of getting back to something I said earlier, was the almost immediate changes that were pushed for and advocated in previously covered states by the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So the Section 4 formula, which determined the extent to which Section 5 would be enforced, has been invalidated. And almost immediately, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Florida implemented legislative changes that made it more difficult for Black people to vote. And the only reason why they were able to do that was because they no longer had to deal with the Section 5. So this is important for an additional reason, because as we all know, not all laws, civil rights or otherwise, are enforced with the same vigor. And so it matters who wins elections, right? You all have heard the phrase, elections have consequences, right? So we see a sort of roller coaster in enforcement on voting and civil rights, depending on which party is in control of the White House. So I mentioned earlier that I'm finishing a book on voter suppression. And the book looks at the role of ideology in voter suppression. The book is titled More Than Just Partisanship. And and the point that I'm making is the focus on partisanship, and we hear this a lot, Republicans reply, oh, well, Democrats do it too. Oh, wait a second. The Democrats of that immediate post-Reconstruction period that I mentioned a few moments ago were conservatives and would be Republicans today. So the real story on voter suppression for me is more than just partisanship, it's also ideological. And there's a through line, a thread, as was mentioned earlier, that ties together voter suppression. And it's really about conservative opposition to the reality of Black citizenship. And so in the last 7 years, there have been more than 1,300 legislative changes proposed across the country that pertain to voting. The overwhelming majority of those are passed by Republicans. And given that the ideological diversity doesn't exist in our parties as it once did, and party has largely become a proxy for ideology, the vast majority of those laws have not just been proposed by Republicans, but proposed by conservatives. And when you look at the full nature of those changes, and many of them are innocuous, but the ones that have the most negative impact on Black access to the ballot have all been proposed by conservatives. And so I just want to close by asking everyone who's watching this to keep in mind that laws are not self-executing, and that the energy that is put into making sure that positive motion occurs doesn't just result in positive motion. There are others on the other side who are pushing just as hard and just as faithfully, and in many ways for a longer period of time, to make sure that gains that occur in one place are eventually reversed in another, which brings us to voter suppression. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 advocated, advanced, and changed the full makeup of Black voting in the United States. So in 1965, there were only about 60 Black people elected to office in the covered states, in the states that were covered by the Voting Rights Act. By 1968, that number had grown to 234. By 1974, that number had grown to 1,397. And by 1981, there were more than 2,500 Black people elected to office in those covered states. Well, that number has exploded over the years, and there are more than 10,000 Black elected officials in covered states. All of that is a reflection and a reaction and a result of the Voting Rights Act. Well, now, given Shelby versus Holder, and given what is likely to be a 6-3 conservative majority on the US Supreme Court, all of these advancements, let me repeat it, all of these advancements are now in trouble. And so as we think about how to react, how to respond, I'm heartened by the turnout that we're seeing in early voting so far, but that has to continue. And we need to hope that we get some legislative majorities on both sides of the Hill to make sure that there are some laws put in place to help mitigate many of the negative things that are likely to occur at the court level. So I'll stop there. Just want to thank you all again for inviting me to join you, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
I was muted. Thank you, Professor Fauntroy. Now we hear from our final speaker, Professor Johnson.
Good afternoon, and congratulations to Howard on its first Howard Homecoming virtual conference. Thank you to Dr. Scott, Dr. Fauntroy, and Dean Henderson for their insightful comments. And it's a great honor to have been invited to speak on this panel. So I'd like to focus my remarks today on a fairly new phenomenon that has exacerbated voter suppression in the United States, called foreign election interference. So my interest in this topic originally arose after the 2016 presidential election. I was on my way to deliver remarks about the Mueller indictment on the radio, and I was reviewing the indictment that had just come out. And I was shocked to discover, right, the vast scope that foreign election interference had taken in the United States. And as I continued to read the indictment, I actually realized that I also had been a victim of Russian election interference like most Americans, right? I had followed during the 2016 election cycle and before, I had followed a Facebook page started by someone called Blacktivist, and I thought it had been generated by a Black Lives Matter activist, and I enjoyed the content. And like many folks, when I read the indictment, I discovered that this individual, like many others, was a Russian troll. And so it turns out that I, like a majority of Americans, had been an unwitting victim of Russian election interference. And so the more I read about election interference and the more I followed Robert Mueller's work and his eventual report, the more disturbed I became and the more I wanted to research and write about this topic. and the significant impact that it's had on our electoral process in the United States. So just to give a little bit of background, many of us are familiar with foreign election interference at this point, but the goal of Russia's foreign election interference campaign was to sow maximum discord, chaos, and polarization in the US electorate, and to undermine our faith in one another and in our electoral process. In short, the Russian government sought to exploit our open society, our free exchange of ideas, using this new tool of social media against us. Russia understood that a divided America is less effective at home and abroad, and it understood that a divided America is less able to counter Russia on the global stage. So in 2016, Russia invested in this campaign. It gambled, not knowing how successful it would be, and it ultimately, to its own surprise, won. The campaign was more successful than they had even imagined. Their preferred candidate won, and the American public for quite some time was not fully aware of the scope of that effort until long after the election, until after the Mueller report was concluded. So Robert Mueller's investigation brought the full scope of the campaign to the public's consciousness. And what we found through his report and the report of various investigative agencies, as well as various bipartisan congressional reports, was that really the Russians had studied American society, right? And this was nothing new to the Russian government, right? They had spent time throughout the Cold War really studying race in America and using race in America as a way of kind of undermining and critiquing democracy globally. But this time, their critiques and their studies of American fissures were directed inward at us. And the goal was to, as I noted, increase greater polarization in American society. And voter suppression was also a key element of this interference campaign, right? Russian hackers developed messages on social media that were micro-targeted at minority communities and that were designed to undermine faith in the electoral process and to encourage minority communities not to vote. So just a few statistics about what happened before, right? So there was a group, the Internet Research Agency, that was a Russian entity with ties to the Kremlin. It hired hundreds of trolls, and these trolls, their full-time job was to post fake news and socially divisive content on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other platforms. And the Russian government spent millions on this operation. And this wasn't anything really new for the Russian government. They had actually been engaged in this form of election interference for over a decade, right? In many of the former Soviet satellite states, they had perfected this model of studying their societies and using internal divisions against electoral processes. They then expanded those efforts to Western European elections. And then finally, they brought it to the US to a lesser degree in 2014, but full on in 2016. And so in 2016, some of the statistics, right? It's likely that if you were on social media in 2016, at some point, you either followed or you forwarded content generated by a Russian troll, right? Studies revealed that the IRA had more than 800,000 organic posts on Facebook, more than 120,000 posts on Instagram, and the posts reached over 146 million Americans. The IRA created 3,800 Twitter accounts. They had thousands of followers, including US politicians, and ultimately they reached over 1.4 million US voters on that platform. So the operation, in addition to sowing discord and division amongst all segments of American society, it specifically targeted the African American community by recruiting Black audiences through the promotion of supposedly authentic Black media, right? So the social media campaign used malicious misdirection, candidate support, redirection, and turnout depression to achieve their objectives. And some of the more disturbing aspects of foreign election interference is that it left social media and entered the real world, right? In several instances, foreign agents organized rallies, under the auspices of fake domestic usernames, right? Where they invited people with opposing polarized views to attend, hoping to spark conflict and violence in the real world. In fact, the Charlottesville rally was actually an event that was promoted by Russian agents online. And as we all know, it resulted in the death of a counter-protester. So the revelations about the campaign reveal again that Russia really understood some of the vulnerabilities about our democratic processes and also the fissures in our society. Now, this effort has continued through the 2018 midterms, and it's occurring now, right? So today, much of the misinformation that we see from this Russian effort focuses on claims that mail-in voting will lead to fraud. And it's much easier for them to engage in this effort because they simply need to amplify the statements being made by our own president, right? And intelligence officials over the summer released reports showing that Russian agents had also engaged in efforts to denigrate Vice President Biden as being corrupt and mentally unfit. Their misinformation online about COVID and the election have also collided, right? So there's misinformation online about a deep state hoax to create COVID as a hoax in order to create fraud through mail-in ballots. So all of these misinformation narratives are floating around online and are being amplified by Russian agents. And so we also see how these narratives can create the potential for violence. So right now, many are concerned, right, about the fact that there have been reports that armed militias may be gearing up to go to voting places on election day, right? A scenario that could lead not only to voter intimidation at the polls, but also violence and potentially violence in minority areas. And many are also concerned about the post-election, right? So if there's a delay in the vote count, right, that opens up the door for increased narratives about fraud and delegitimization of the electoral process, right? So Russian disinformation aims to wear down the public, to get us to question what's real and what's not, and to get us to assume that everything's rigged, all things that are the opposite of what makes a healthy democracy, right? And so, as noted, the biggest threat could still be on the way. What happens in the post-election, the narratives that are passed after after election day, when votes may still be counted. So there are a number of recommendations that have been made about the importance of continued information being provided to the public about election interference campaigns. There are a number of legislative initiatives that can be pursued. There are a number of public-private initiatives through the tech companies and through intelligence agencies that need to continue to be pursued so that these election interference efforts are highlighted, spotted, and made public. But ultimately, what I want to leave everyone here with is the knowledge that what's most important, right, to defeating foreign election interference is the fact that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? We need to continuously talk about foreign election interference. We need to understand how it works so that we can counter it ourselves and be aware when we are being targeted so that we don't become unwitting victims of what was likely to become an ongoing campaign that we will have to deal with in each election cycle. Thank you. I look forward to exploring these ideas further in the Q&A.
Okay, somebody wants to know realistically, what do you all think will be the outcome after the election? And as we are still fighting the fight of civil rights movement, what does change look like for the future?
Well, let's see. Are you asking us to address the question?
Yeah, anybody who wants to address that question.
Well, I'll start off and invite my colleagues to join in. Notwithstanding the polling data that we have seen, national polling data, which I think at this stage in the process is virtually useless. and the polling data from states that are considered especially important: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida. I think the polling data can be very misleading, because I think it suggests an outcome that may or may not actually occur. And I think that there is some distortion in that data in ways that perhaps will breed complacency at a time when it is especially important to fight against that. I think there has been, and I think Professor Johnson touched on it, a targeted use of very high-tech voter suppression efforts. Some of it generated, yes, by Russians, but some of it a part of the political campaign of President Trump in 2016. Cambridge Analytica, which is a well-known computer company in Great Britain, has been using data that targeted voters in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Ohio. It was estimated that they affected some 3.5 million African-American voters with disinformation and discouragement. We also have an obligation to focus some attention on the social media engines like Facebook and Twitter, which have sort of adopted a First Amendment neutral posture that has largely opened their platforms to a lot of manipulative information that clearly is distorted in terms of voting. Now, they have more recently, particularly in the case of Facebook, sort of indicated that they have challenged some tweets, or rather Facebook posts from President Trump. But that has largely been the result of a campaign undertaken by civil rights advocacy communities across the board to really encourage Facebook to address these issues, and that has been helpful. So I think the outcome, that's my real point, is hard to predict. I don't think the polling data is a sure indication of what the actual election itself will be. And again, I think in, if the current administration continues, obviously we can anticipate certain obvious challenges. And if there are changes in leadership, let us hope those changes will be more enlightened to some of the concerns that I think have been identified, which I hope is the case. So I'll stop there.
If I can sort of co-sign what Wade has said and deal with the second part of the question with regard to the civil rights movement, it is painful, but in many ways we are having to refight and relitigate things that were previously sort of settled. And while I don't think there's any question that America is better now than it was, 60 years ago, that certainly doesn't mean that we can't return to a worse period if we aren't careful. And so the questioner was asking about what does the change look like and what might things look like after the election. I have to confess that I am a little concerned about the rise of these domestic terrorist groups, which largely operate unchecked and unfettered, and their capacity and willingness to engage in violence to stoke the fires even more broadly than they currently are. I just want to remind everybody, there's so much going on in the world, that it's easy to forget certain stories. But less than a month ago, a 17-year-old kid from Illinois was driven to Kenosha, Wisconsin, with an AR-15 rifle and shot someone on the street who was peacefully protesting. And there are people celebrating this as if it's a defense of some kind of natural right, or if it's a defense of a certain way of life. And I just am concerned that that kind of thinking is probably a little broader than I initially considered. And so I'm worried, quite frankly, what the aftermath of the election might look like with a president who cannot speak more than 10 seconds without saying that stokes division and seeks to undermine the integrity of elections across the country, and continues to shout that it's rigged. But it's only rigged if he loses. If he wins, then of course, everything went well. So I'm worried, quite frankly, and just want to encourage people to keep an eye on that, because as we get closer to election day, and certainly in the immediate aftermath, if it is a very close election, we could see some problems. Of course, one way to overcome that is with overwhelming turnout. And things seem to be moving in that direction, but we need to push that as hard as we can to make sure it happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I remember when I was teaching back, I guess I had Gen X students in my class, and they had come along during an era, I think, where their parents had put them into integrated schools and really sort of didn't want their children to learn about the civil rights movement and all the pain that them and their grandparents had gone through. And I used to have students that would challenge me. There's no way we could turn back the clock on all these things. But now you have students coming to you saying, this is real. Because I always tell people you need to go and study post-Reconstruction. I mean, we had members in Congress doing Reconstruction. We had elected officials in state houses. We had a lot. We had a lot of things, but yet, we lost it during the Jim Crow era. And so this whole thing of violence and the acceptance of violence, it's part of what is frightening me, that when you get a governor who there's this big plot to kidnap her, and people don't even seem to be concerned about it. No big deal. And then they mention a second governor. So where is this country going? So, that's one of my big concerns. If we re-elect the president, it just seems like we've lost all our moral values and our standards that we grew up believing in. And where do we go from here? Darin, I think there's a specific question that was sent to you. Let me see. Where is it? Okay, I can't find it. That was
I see it in the chat if you want me to just.
okay, why don't you read it and then address it?
Yeah, so the question in the chat is how prevalent is foreign election fraud, and what other types of countries are participating in it? So as part of my answer, I just wanted to echo the comments of my co-panelists. I'm very concerned about the state of polarization of democracy in America. I'm very concerned about the fact that we have foreign actors like Russia, right, that have studied our society and that know how to exploit divisions in it and to create fissures that undermine our electoral process and our faith in our processes. And I'm further concerned that we have domestic agents that are doing the same thing, members of political parties, groups that are creating conspiracies like QAnon, just kind of inflaming these really just false, dangerous, harmful narratives that are catching steam, right? You have adherents to these ideas, some of whom are running for Congress right now. And it's frightening. It's a scary time in America. And so that's why I think one of the things we need, again, is more light than heat, right? We need for intelligence agencies to be doing what they've started doing this summer, which is coming out very publicly and giving public service announcements and saying, okay, this is what we're seeing. These are the narratives that we're seeing. Be aware of what's going on, encouraging the American public to use reliable media sources. the fact that we have companies like Microsoft and Google and others in collaboration with government agencies releasing information online about what they're seeing, right? We've seen Facebook start to cut off several of these QAnon accounts. We've seen Twitter start to post false accounts, right? And remove false accounts, even coming from our president. You know, one of the things that's come out in this election cycle is the question was how prevalent is foreign election and fraud. It's never ended, right? So the foreign election interference in 2016 just continued, right? It just, the efforts just continue to sow division generally in American society until the next election cycle, like the Charlottesville protest. But one of the interesting things that observers have noted about election interference in this cycle is Russians have a much lighter lift. All they have to do is amplify what's being said in the White House, right? All the misinformation about voter fraud, about the failure or the potential for fraud with mail-in ballots, they don't need to create those narratives. They just need to amplify them. And so unfortunately, our president has made the misinformation cycle that much easier, as have those who are backing those narratives. So foreign election fraud is an ongoing aspect, I think, of our, not only our election cycle, but just our social media narratives online. And I think it's something that we're all going to have to continually learn how to grapple with.
Okay. One person wants to know, if the Democrats win all the branches, do you think that at this time, would the Democrats prosecute the current administration and all those involved in voter suppression and other illegalities? Maybe one of our lawyers want to
I
take
invite
that.
my colleagues to address that.
You know, I could take a stab. You
Okay.
know, I'm not going to predict what the Democrats would do, and I'd rather pull it out of kind of a partisan framework. Will the Democrats do this? Because I think that actually cheapens the effect of voter suppression, voter fraud, and criminal activity. It's not just the Democrats kind of doing a tit for tat response. You know, I think the reality is that many activities that qualify as voter suppression, right? Well, it's interesting. There are a lot of things that constitute voter suppression. Some are activities that are undertaken by legislatures, right? And executives through quote unquote legal process, right? Trying to limit the number of balloting places, trying to limit the time in which people can register, limiting the circumstances under which people can register to vote. That's all voter suppression. And that's done through kind of a quasi-legal process, right? And then there are other forms of voter suppression that can constitute violations of criminal acts. And I think those instances, right? Instances where you have people maybe pretending to be individuals who are collecting ballots and they're not, right? Or people disposing of ballots, or people actually intimidating folks at voting stations. Those are crimes and those should be prosecuted, right? And they should be prosecuted by local prosecutors or federal prosecutors. And those individuals may or may not be Democrats. So that's actually, I think, an easier case, right? For the folks that violate, that engage in activity that violate criminal statutes. The harder case is what happens when our elected officials, right, decide to pursue voter suppression strategies through their day-to-day electoral activities. And I think that's much more problematic and much more difficult to address.
Yeah, may I just pick up on that quickly by adding, while voter suppression is a national concern, because our elections are largely state efforts, to the extent that there will be investigations at the congressional level, those won't necessarily get at state decision-making that has a suppressive impact.
Yep.
So we need to be careful. So this all assumes, of course, that the Trump administration leaves and that the Democrats take control of the Senate. I think we need to be careful not to devote so much time to investigating that group, and I think there should be some, and not deal with some of the legislative problems that exist in our electoral systems. Now, I believe you can walk and chew gum, but I think that there's some people out in the country that are going to want to go for blood and want to investigate everybody and send everybody to jail. And while I understand the need for that or the interest in that, I do also think that what we need to be focusing on at the federal and state levels are much more important and much more needed sort of legislative remedies to protect and advance access to the ballot box for people around the country. If that happens, then everything gets changed, notwithstanding what will likely be federal court challenges to any of those federal legislative changes.
Well, I think there is some truth in that. I certainly think there is pending legislation in Congress dealing with election administration that would provide resources to states to take corrective action that would constitute important reforms. I think that and the Voting Rights Act are essential pieces of legislation that need to be adopted and implemented. But I also recognize that, the federal government really is in desperate need of rebuilding and restructuring. The Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice has been decimated at the top by policies, promoted at the White House level. The professional staff, many are still there, but they are in need of support, funding. There needs to be a new commitment to reinvigorate civil rights enforcement, and that only comes with a new administration. I'm concerned about the issue of violence that we've touched on in this conversation that could occur in the aftermath of the election. I certainly know the president is promoting a level of chaos that is intended to achieve that sort of disruptive impact that we all fear. And I think there is a hope on his part that some of those cases will find their way in a Supreme Court or to a Supreme Court with a newly appointed justice who is likely to be committed to his continuation in office. And those struggles we have yet to go through. I think Michael, Professor Fauntroy, as he mentioned, really the best antidote to those problems is an overwhelming turnout. And we're beginning to see elements of that, but I think that needs to be reinforced in the coming weeks ahead between now and the election, because we need the massive turnout. And then one last point to end my remarks on this. Look, America is in desperate need of a deeper understanding of how we got to where we are today. We touched on aspects of history that are clearly relevant to the American condition of today. There are two pending resolutions in Congress, both of which I think are important, and I would encourage our listeners to look at them. One is H.R. 40, sponsored by Sheila Jackson Lee, that would establish a commission to look at the efficacy of reparations for African Americans. It's a long-standing issue. It's been in Congress for many years, but it's gaining traction. About 160 co-sponsors in the House now. Clearly, nothing will happen until after the election, but keep an eye on that, support it. Hopefully that understanding that emanates from it will be important. The other is H-Con Res 100, sponsored by Barbara Lee, to establish a national commission on truth, racial healing, and transformation. We are one of the few countries experiencing the kind of population change, diversity, dealing with the challenges that they present that has not looked deeply at its own history. Given the period of enslavement that took place here, the fact that you have efforts like the 1619 Project by the New York Times under attack because it is purported to be a distortion of history. You have the president promoting something called the 1776 Commission, which is intended to negate what the 1619 Project has helped to address. These questions, these ideological fights framed as academic issues, ultimately are going to be addressed and have to be addressed, I think, by the academy if we are going to move forward. But those commissions, I think, are important elements to a better country.
Okay, since we have, I assume we have some students here, and I've seen a couple of questions on here about people who don't vote, don't believe in voting, haven't been convinced that they need to vote. So, well, before we close out, I'd like to hear from each of you sort of what would be your closing argument to people who are saying that there's no need to vote, even though they see the state of the country. How do we encourage people, especially Black African Americans, that they should vote and there's something in it for them?
Why don't we go in reverse order, and I'll
Yeah.
close it out, but I'll start with Professor Johnson, maybe Professor Fauntroy, and I'll close.
So I would just encourage those students who themselves, are questioning whether they should vote, or have peers that are questioning whether they should vote. I would just encourage you to consider the legacy of our forebears, right? And all of the blood, sweat, and tears that was lost in the fight to recapture the vote, right? That had been guaranteed after the Civil War and then lost. And then, another century of struggle to regain it. So to consider that, right, all of the sacrifice that was made so that we'd have the right to vote. And then even more recently, just consider the result of the election in 2000 and 2016, right? In 2000, the popularly elected individual did not achieve the presidency, and it came down to a few hundred votes in Florida. And as we know from 2016, the popularly elected individual did not achieve the presidency again. And it came down to thousands of votes over 3 states. So every vote matters, and every vote can make a difference in what this nation looks like, right? We've seen so many violations of our democratic norms and of our human rights and of our American values over the past 4 years. And you have the power to help turn that around. So please vote. And please encourage everyone to vote. It matters.
So for me, that question, I would respond to that question with a few questions. So I would ask that person, so do you like to drink clean water? Do you like to breathe clean air? Do you like to eat food that is safe, right? Because if the answer is yes to those things, then you need to know that whether or not you have clean water or clean air or clean food is largely a result of political decisions, right? So by not participating, you're giving somebody else the right and responsibility to make decisions over your own health. And whether or not whether or not you pay certain levels of taxes, or whether or not you have access to certain banking options and retirements, and all of these kind of financial, health-related, sort of dignity-related issues are all tied at one level or another to political decisions. So if you're good with not having a hand in that, then okay, but just understand you're giving somebody else authority over your own condition. But if you think that your dignity and your humanity is just as valuable as anybody else's, then you should participate. Even an oppressed people has some level of responsibility as to participate, as W.E.B. Du Bois said over 100 years ago. So I would just simply ask those questions and appeal to that person's sense of self-worth.
Self-worth and self-interest, and obviously respect for those who have struggled so much on our behalf over the years. I mean, the fact that John Lewis has passed and his contribution to transforming this country for the better, as he called it, getting into good trouble, has made a significant difference, but it was predicated almost entirely on the vote and mobilizing the electoral power that we have. When you don't vote, in effect, you are casting a ballot in favor of your opposition. If you're an African American who chooses not to vote, you are generally speaking giving power to people who don't have your interests at heart, at least based on the historic record. You can see what people have done in the past. It's one of the reasons, as has been stated previously, the effort is so great in preventing you not to vote. You know, those messages, I saw some recently on Facebook suggesting that Black people look at the conditions that we face and neither party is responsive to your needs, therefore don't vote. And some of that has been identified as Russian interference, recognizing that they understand the touch points of the American psyche and why African Americans feel so alienated. You know, when someone like Doc Rivers says, I love this country, but I just don't understand why this country doesn't love me back. It is a statement of frustration that has been born, unfortunately, in both houses, both parties. What I think we now have to do, though, is to recognize that we have the power over our own destiny if we can begin to exercise it. And that is the challenge at hand. So I would hope that at this time, given the importance of the election, you have people speaking out who have not voted previously. Shaquille O'Neal, much to his credit, said, look, I didn't vote previously, but given what is at stake now, I'm going to vote. I'm hoping that people will use that as a role model to inspire us all to raise our voices in the only way that makes a difference in the context of an election. And that is to be able to cast a ballot. That's why this is so important. Perhaps at another time, we can discuss the importance of the Electoral College and how that needs to be changed and challenged as well, because you mentioned that the person who won the popular vote, at least in 2 instances we know since the start of the 21st century, has had that vote negated by the Electoral College, and that needs to change.
Well, we are 3 minutes over the time. This has been a very engaging conversation. We really enjoyed our presenters, and there are still some questions in the chat. Some people want to know if you would mind leaving your email address so that they could follow up with you on the questions they didn't get a chance to ask. And yeah, there were a lot of other issues we did not get a chance to touch. And I'm glad that Wade mentioned the Electoral College, because I had that down in my list of topics that I wanted us to talk about, as well as sort of looking at where do we go from here in terms of voter suppression. You know, a lot is contingent on what happens with the election. But what if the election doesn't go the way we would want it to go? You know, what is our plan for following up? You know, I'm hearing so many people, and some people are very serious talking about leaving the country. In fact, one of my relatives has been doing research, moving to one of the African countries. So, but I think, we really have to look seriously at how do we fight this voter suppression. We also didn't get a chance to talk about what the impact of
No,
the
we did not.
census could have
Yeah.
on the future of the country. That, the census even became political this year. And depending on what happens, in terms of how many people, it seems like there were a lot of people that did not participate in the census. So that can have a real negative impact on voter representation going forth, and the ability of states to pass more of these laws, imposing more suppression out here. Wade, you were trying to say something?
No, you
Oh,
go right ahead. Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to have to say we have to close this. Really, somebody said we needed a part 1 and a part 2 of this. We really did, because there are so many issues relating to, we just scratched the surface here, and we had 3 experts here that could have gone on. Each one could have spent at least a half hour, and we only gave them 10 to 12 minutes to talk. So I want to again thank Dr. Dean Williams and Dean Holly Walker for planning this conference and for allowing us this platform to talk about voter suppression. Dean Williams, do you need to say anything before we close out?
Thank you, Dr. Scott. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I have just dropped the calendar for tomorrow's sessions in the chat. Please snatch it now, and we hope to see you tomorrow.